The fire had been dead for 2 days. The dog hadn't moved from beside the oven, and Anthony Reeves was still warm enough to crack a window. But 3 years earlier, nobody believed a house could be built around a giant clay oven.
You are going to build your whole house around an oven, Reeves.
A house wrapped around one giant clay oven. It'll hold heat longer than any iron stove.
That monster will eat more wood than a forest fire. You'll freeze by New Year's.
Anthony, you can't be serious. That much clay. It'll never hold heat.
I've done the calculations, Martha. The clay absorbs the fire and radiates it back for hours.
My father says he's gone mad, but Reeves never did care what folks thought.
They'll see. The old books were right.
He dug clay from the riverbank alone, while the town watched and waited for him to fail. The dog lay on the bank, watching Anthony dig bucket after bucket of cold clay.
Still at it. Reeves, you know that mud won't hold fire any better than a snowbank.
It's not just mud. The same clay holds a brick kiln's heat for days. It'll hold mine.
Martha came down to the riverbank, a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth.
Anthony, is all this really worth it? You could just buy a good iron stove.
I've read the old books, Martha. A big stove burns less wood, not more.
He built a wooden frame the size of a small room and began to pack the wet clay into it with his bare hands.
Have you seen that thing? It's bigger than my cabin. No way it stands.
As the shape rose, it looked less like an oven and more like a monument to stubbornness.
Let them laugh. When winter comes, they'll see.
He finished the final clay layer, smoothing it until the oven stood like a monolith in the center of the growing cabin. Then he lit a small, careful fire in its belly to cure the clay without cracking it.
Slow and steady now. The old books warned against rushing the first fire.
Around the warm clay, he raised the log walls, fitting each timber so the oven would stand as the heart of the home. When the last window was set, winter's first freeze painted frost across the panes.
Anthony, it's Martha. I've come to see this oven of yours.
She stepped inside and laid her hand on the cold-looking surface of the clay.
It's just mud, Anthony. How can mud hold fire?
Clay holds heat, Martha. The fire's been out since morning, but feel that warmth.
Winter's first snow covered the ground, but inside, the oven held its warmth. That evening, he lit the first real fire. Not a cure, but a hot, fast burn that roared for 2 hours. By midnight, the flames were gone, but the clay still radiated heat, warm as summer earth. In the morning, frost etched the window panes, yet the cabin was comfortable enough to move without a coat. He walked into town for flour and nails. Eli stood by the general store like a winter crow.
Better chop more wood. Oven man. That beast'll be screaming for fuel before morning.
Anthony only shrugged. His woodpile had barely shrunk. The oven had sipped a few logs, not the stack Eli imagined. Martha was waiting at his door when he returned.
Anthony, how often do you feed that thing? Every hour?
Once a day. Sometimes less.
She left, shaking her head. That night, the first real storm of the season tore through the valley. Winds howled and snow piled against the walls, but inside the oven house, the air stayed still and warm. After that first storm, Anthony lit only an evening fire. He fed the oven for 1 hour, then let it die, and the clay held warmth all night long. In the morning, the cabin was still comfortable. The oven felt warm to the touch, 12 hours after the flames had gone.
12 hours? This clay remembers fire like nothing I've ever built.
Across the valley, Eli Mercer was feeding his iron stove every 3 hours. The cold ate his woodpile faster than he could swing the axe.
This cursed stove is a bottomless pit. We'll run out before January.
Saw Reeves' place at dusk. Barely a wisp of smoke. You'd think he'd frozen solid by now.
But Anthony's woodpile told a different story. A week's worth of logs for any other cabin lasted him a month.
Let Eli chop. This oven doesn't waste anything.
In Eli's house, his wife wrapped in blankets. Their stove a hungry mouth that never gave back, and the longer winter held, the more Anthony kept his silence. In the second week of deep winter, the temperature plunged to 30 below. The river froze solid in one night, but inside the oven house, Anthony sat reading in his shirt sleeves. The fire had been dead since yesterday morning.
The clay still held yesterday's fire. The dog hadn't moved from its warmth.
Eli ran out of wood before noon. He came to the oven house, not to ask, but to demand.
Reeves, I know you've got wood. Open this door.
Anthony opened the door. Eli stepped inside expecting cold, but the warmth stopped him mid-stride.
How is it warm in here? The stove's stone cold. You haven't lit a fire.
The fire's been out since yesterday. Feel the clay.
Eli laid his hand on the oven. The clay was warm, warmer than his own cabin had been at noon. He left without another word, more frightened by what he couldn't explain than by the cold.
No smoke for 2 days. His windows are frost-free. Something unnatural's in that oven house.
The rumor spread like fire in dry grass. By noon, the village buzzed with impossible claims.
Anthony, the whole valley thinks you are a sorcerer. How long does that oven really hold its heat?
Once a day, sometimes less.
He led her outside to the woodpile. It was so small it looked like kindling for a single night.
This can't be right. Eli burns more than this in a single morning.
She spent an hour inside, feeling the clay, measuring the warmth. When she left, her face was the color of snow.
Martha, is it true? Does his oven really hold heat for a whole day?
It holds heat longer than I can explain. His woodpile is almost untouched, but he won't tell us how.
That night, the real panic began. Wood stocks in the valley were lower than anyone had admitted, and the one man who knew how to survive it had stayed silent all winter. The mayor called every cabin to the general store. The valley's wood would be gone before February.
Reeves knows something. His cabin stays warm with no smoke. He's not sharing what he's found.
I burn one fire at dusk. The clay holds the heat, that's all.
The room erupted. No one believed one fire could warm a house through the night.
Then prove it. No fire for 3 days. Let 3 of us watch. If it stays warm, we'll believe.
3 days? You'll beg for wood before morning.
I don't beg. Start the test whenever you like.
They agreed on a date. No fire for 3 days. Temperatures would be measured each morning. The test would settle everything. Or it would make Anthony a pariah, but no one in that room could guess the extraordinary thing that would happen next. The test began on a Tuesday morning. Anthony lit one final, fierce fire and stepped back. Eli checked his pocket watch and wrote the time in a notebook. Day 1, 68 degrees. Anthony read by daylight. The dog stretched and yawned, still pressing against the warm clay. Day 2, 62 degrees. The cabin was still comfortable. Frost crept across the windows, but inside, no one shivered. Day 3, 51 degrees. Cool enough for a heavy coat, but the water bucket hadn't frozen. The oven held its warmth like a living thing.
I don't understand. There hasn't been a fire since Tuesday.
It's still warm, after 3 whole days. That's not possible.
It's not magic. The clay just remembers the fire.
The test was finished. The oven house had done exactly what Anthony claimed. 3 days without fire, and the house was still livable. But the real test was only beginning. Outside, the valley's woodpile was almost gone, and winter was only half over. By that evening, 24 villagers packed into the cabin, touching the warm clay with their own hands.
You could teach the rest of us. The whole valley is running on empty.
The flue wins through the mass. A quick, hot fire, and the clay holds the heat for days.
We don't have time for ancient fairy tales. We need wood now.
He pulled a fragile, leather-bound book from a shelf. Inside were woodcuts of Russian masonry heaters that had warmed whole villages for centuries. A survey of the valley's woodstocks confirmed the worst. Fuel would run out within 3 weeks.
I can show you how to build a small one. All you need is clay and a little patience.
I'll do it. My family can't chop another cord of frozen wood.
But many stood silent, eyeing Anthony with suspicion. The old way was hard to abandon, and as the wind picked up outside, the fate of the valley still hung in the balance. The mayor held up a hand. We cannot all build ovens in a week. The clay is frozen.
Then bring the sick and old here. The oven can warm us all until we find another way.
By nightfall, the cabin filled with pallets. Mothers wrapped children in blankets. Old men leaned against the warm clay. The dog wove between the pallets, finding a spot beside the oven each night.
Even Eli brought his wife. He wouldn't stay himself, but he carried her through the snow.
Pride is a colder thing than winter.
He lit one short fire each evening. A few armloads of wood kept 30 people from freezing. The clay mass held the heat long after the flames died, radiating through the long nights. The joke that had followed him all autumn had become a sanctuary. But outside, the winter still had teeth, and the valley's wood would not last forever. 3 days after the cabin became a shelter, Eli's wife worsened. A cough rattled her chest on the pallet.
I can't let her die. Show me how that oven works. Please, Anthony.
Anthony led him to the oven and traced the spiraling flue with a calloused finger.
Not magic. Clay and careful fire, a quick hot burn, and the mass remembers warmth. You feed it once in the evening, not all night. The clay does the rest.
All those months wasted on mockery. The answer was here the whole time.
He extended a hand, and for the first time, there was no sneer behind it. The dog wagged its tail, thumping against the floor, as if even it knew the truce mattered.
We'll start a small oven for your house tomorrow. Your wife won't be cold again.
The valley's hardest man had become a student, but winter wasn't finished teaching. The next morning, Anthony and Eli broke frozen clay from the riverbank and carried stones through the snow.
Didn't think frozen mud could feel like hope.
How long until it's done? My family's burning furniture?
The valley's last cord of dry wood was burned that week. After that, there was nothing but green timber that hissed and smoked.
Fingers so cold they might snap. But if this works, she won't cough again tonight.
You feed it once at dusk tonight. Let it burn hot for an hour, no more.
At dusk, the first fire caught in the new oven. Smoke spiraled cleanly through the flue, and the clay began to warm. Eli's wife, still pale, propped herself up and watched the oven. For the first time in weeks, she smiled.
It's working. The clay is holding it.
But one finished oven wouldn't save the valley. The first new fire was burning, and time was running out. By the end of the week, he watched from his window as neighbors dragged chairs and broken crates to feed their stoves. The valley was burning its own furniture just to stay alive. His own woodpile, stacked tight beneath the eaves, had barely shrunk, a silent accusation he could no longer ignore. Martha found him there, her breath clouding in the frozen air.
You could just close your door, Anthony. Let the rest of us manage.
Then, what am I saving? A warm room while my neighbors burn their tables. That's not a life.
He walked to the village square, climbed onto a barrel, and raised a voice that cut through the wind.
I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. You don't need wood, you need clay. Come to the oven house at dawn.
The line formed before he stepped down. Mothers, old men, even the blacksmith who had mocked him loudest. By nightfall, the cabin floor was covered in clay dust and boot prints. The dog wove between them, undisturbed as always. Teaching began in earnest, and Anthony's home would never be quiet again. 3 days later, the frame of an oven rose in Ben's house, smaller than Anthony's, but built on the same truth.
Please work. Just hold the heat.
The fire burned fast and hot for an hour, then died. 10 hours later, the clay was still warm enough to chase away the frost.
Anthony, it's just like your big one. The whole room feels different.
Clay remembers the fire. Now your family has a piece of the sun built into the wall.
Word spread faster than the cold. By morning, A dozen families were breaking frozen ground with pickaxes and shovels.
Never thought I'd be grateful for frozen mud, but here we are.
The valley filled with the sound of digging and the smell of wet clay fires. Anthony stood on his porch at dusk, the dog leaning against his leg. For the first time in weeks, he looked less tired. The valley had started to change, but winter was only half over, and the hardest freeze still lay ahead. By the end of the week, the smoke from 10 new chimneys rose straight into the cold air, thin, brief, and enough. Wood piles that had emptied in days now lasted weeks. The clay ovens were sipping, not devouring. At the next town meeting, Eli Mercer rose to his feet. For a long moment, he said nothing.
That monster was supposed to eat all our wood. It sips it like a bird. I was wrong.
Laughter rippled through the room. Not mockery, but relief. Anthony stood at the back, the dog pressed against his leg.
We owe you, Anthony. The whole valley would have frozen without your stubbornness.
The clay did the work. I just remembered what the old books taught.
But even as they celebrated, the coldest week of the year was gathering strength beyond the mountains. That night, the temperature plunged lower than any of them had ever known, and winter had one more lesson to teach. That promised freeze arrived, a week of iron cold that tested every new oven in the valley. But the clay held. Not a single family that had built an oven lost their fire that week, and when the thaw finally came, it came like a pardon. Icicles dripped, and the snow sank into the earth. Anthony sat on his porch, the dog sprawled in the sun. The oven inside was cool to the touch, but its work was done.
Never been so glad to be wrong.
You kept your family warm. That's all that ever mattered.
Will you teach the next town over? They'll need your ovens too.
If they'll listen.
The dog thumped its tail against the porch boards, as if it understood the peace that had settled over the valley. The oven house was no longer a punchline. It was the proof that the oldest wisdom had never left the world, only been forgotten. This is what he showed them. Monday dusk, one hot, fast fire, fed for 2 hours, then nothing. By midnight, the flames were dead, but the clay was still too hot to press a palm against. Tuesday morning, 68 degrees inside. The chimney was cold, but the house was not. Wednesday, 63 degrees. Frost on the windows, but the dog never left its spot. Thursday morning, 55 degrees. Cool enough for a heavy coat, but above freezing. 3 full days without a fire, and the house was still livable.
Still warm. After 3 days.
It wasn't a trick. It was physics. The clay mass absorbed the fierce heat and released it slowly, like a banked sun inside the walls.
It was never about the fire. It was about what the clay remembered.
The counterintuitive truth. Bigger meant less wood. A quick, hot burn, then days of quiet warmth. And that was how a man who built his house around a giant clay oven stayed warm 3 days after the fire died. Years before, Anthony had found a brittle book in a junk shop 3 valleys over. The pages were crumbling, but the woodcuts were sharp. Inside were illustrations of massive stoves, Russian, German, Finnish, that had warmed whole farmhouses through the coldest winters. In some villages, a single masonry stove stayed warm for a week after the fire was raked out, enough to bake bread on the 3rd day.
The fire doesn't warm the room, it heats the clay. The clay heats you, burn hot and fast, and the mass drinks the heat, smolder, and you feed only the chimney.
The mass remembers the fire, gives it back in a slow, steady breath. That was the principle they'd lost.
Bigger meant less wood. That was the truth they'd buried under a century of iron stoves.
He hadn't invented anything. He just remembered what the big stoves always knew. Heat stored in clay never forgets. It's a memory older than iron, and that ancient knowledge saved a whole valley. The valley would never forget. Word of the oven house spread beyond the valley. Strangers came with frost-bitten hands, asking to learn what the old books knew.
It's not just for one house. Any house can have a heart made of clay.
The cabin never quite emptied. Some stayed for days, soaking in the quiet warmth before returning to rebuild their own stoves.
You've given us more than wood, Anthony. You've given us back a way of thinking.
The big stoves never stopped working. We just stopped building them.
And the oven itself, always warm, became the center of the home, the way he had always intended. A silent, steady heart. On cold evenings, neighbors still gathered in the cabin, not because they were freezing, but because they discovered that warmth could be shared.
The fire goes out, but the clay remembers. That's all a home really needs.
The man who had been mocked became the keeper of a forgotten truth. He didn't invent anything. He remembered, and the valley remembered with him. On a still winter evening, the cabin settled into its familiar quiet. A candle burned low on the table. The dog lay curled against the clay, its coat rising and falling with slow, contented breaths. Outside, the night was frozen solid, 30 below, but the frost on the windows was as thin as lace. Anthony's hand rested on the dog's head. The fire had been out since midday, but the clay still radiated gentle heat. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The big stoves knew what men forgot. Heat stored in clay never forgets. A memory older than iron, older than the towns that forgot it. The fire goes out, but the clay remembers. That was all a home really needed. And in that quiet, beneath the frozen sky, the oven house held its peace. Sometimes the oldest way is the best. The clay never forgot. The snow fell without hurry that night, blanketing the valley in a silence that had no need for words. From the chimney, a thread of smoke rose straight and thin, barely enough to see against the cold stars. Inside, the oven held the memory of a fire that had been dead for hours, radiating a gentle, steady warmth. The light in the window never flickered. It was the light of clay remembering. The man who had been mocked for building this house had given his neighbors more than heat. He had given them back a truth that was never lost, only waiting beneath the ice of forgotten centuries. He didn't invent anything. He remembered what the big stoves always knew. Heat stored in clay never forgets, and the valley, wrapped in winter, would never forget either.